Recently, I've had a bit of a poetry bender. I think somehow it's just clicked with me more recently. I'm hoping to give a short series of speeches. This will be the first one. It's going to tee up future ones. It's about why English is a language that's two for the price of one. Some of you might know why that is. Hopefully, some of you don't. And I will be teaching you something interesting today. Since I'm telling this story, I will start, as I want to do, with the Romans. This is Rome at the height of its empire. They've got a lot of territory here. You'll notice that they have conquered Britain. Britannia is what the Romans actually called it. And it's hard to see, but they name one of the cities here Londinium, which will become London. And through this process, the Romans spread their language, Latin, all across this area. Of course, not everyone is actually speaking Latin. It's mostly the people in charge of ruling and laws and such. And this will be important to keep in mind, that at the same time that there are all these little pockets of language in various areas, there is this overall legal ruling language of Latin. Okay, but our story is really about English, or Anglo-Saxon, as it was originally kind of called. By the year 400 or so, the Romans are out of Britain, and the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons come into England. These are Germanic tribes. So from this, we're going to establish that English at its core is really a kind of German dialect, you could say. That's what it is at its heart. And they bring their language to Britain, and that's what they begin speaking. Now, for us, this Anglo-Saxon is mostly incomprehensible. With all due respect to the poet of Beowulf, this looks like gibberish. I don't even know how to pronounce it for you if I could. We've got these AE characters fused together. We've got this character called the Thorn. So the character set is different. It's hard to know how to pronounce this. You would need to study this for a little while, maybe a year or so, before you could really understand what's going on here. So basically a different language. So this poem, Beowulf, you might know, it's an epic poem in Anglo-Saxon, recited verbally, roughly 700 to 1,000. So now we're going to skip forward a little bit, and there's a French invasion, if you will, the Norman conquest of Britain. You can't see it on the map, but Normandy, which you might know from D-Day or however else you might know of it, is a little further below on this map. But William the Conqueror comes in, and they're speaking French, and then they take over all this area. So now you've got two languages, French and Anglo-Saxon, which is kind of, you can think of it as related to German. So let's keep this in mind, that there are two languages. At this point now, the language shifts into Anglo-Norman. So you can see that we're going to start to bring both of these two distinct things together. And already that change is going to make this language more intelligible to us. Here's the prologue of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It looks like someone writing English who doesn't know how to spell yet. That's because English hasn't had a standardized spelling. It will also, if you pronounced everything, you would sound like you've got a lot of marshmallows in your mouth, or you've got a Scottish accent. So instead of, I'm not even going to pretend to try it, but you can imagine that this looks pretty close to today's English, with some differences in pronunciation and spelling. It's more or less visually close to modern English, but not quite there yet. So to recap, at this point, we have English coming across as a bastard of German and French. The French itself came from years of Latin evolving into its own language, and Latin and Greek have some interoperability at a high level. And actually, all these languages belong to the Indo-European language family. So they're They're all sort of similar. They're all kind of bumping up against each other in the same areas of the world. But that leads to some interesting dualities, let's say. So the English, as I'm using it in this example, will be what the lower class peasants of German extraction are speaking. On the other hand, the French are now the ruling class, and they have a vocabulary that's more Latin inspired. And so English sort of has two parallel tracks. There's a lot of words which can be expressed in two different ways, and it gives a different flavor if you say it one way or the other. So maybe the peasant will say that he's lucky to work near such a kingly house, and his job is to kill cows. These are punchier verbs. They feel a little more concrete, simple. Maybe the aristocrat living in the same area will say that he is fortunate to live in a regal mansion, and that it's terrible that these peasants are mortifying the beef. Already you can see some interesting distinctions here. Beef is what you would call the food once it's come to your plate. Cow is the animal that you would actually have to kill in order to make the food. So already you can see a kind of economic or social distinction there. And of course, as an English speaker, you know both of these sets of words. So it's up to you to decide which one you really want to use in a given context. Do you want to make it sound a little more flowery, a little more scholarly, abstract, or do you want it to be simple and direct? And typically, people will give the advice that you should pick the Germanic version in most of these cases. As a general rule of thumb, that's probably correct. It tends to be, as I'm saying, more concrete and more understandable. The Latinate or French version will sound a little fancier. But I want to show you why that might not be exactly the case. So now we get into modern English, some minor adjustments to what you've seen before. One trend that's come about more recently is people who think that we should turn English back into its Germanic roots a little bit. So for example, in the 1600s, if you were educated, you'd go to university. That's a Latin root word. And you would probably learn English as well as Latin, and you would use the Latin or whatever Greek you might know to converse with people in your scholarly endeavors. And then you would use English to speak to the common folk. Some people started to feel that this Latin was too fancy and that they needed to bring down the words to a more grounded level. And these are some interesting examples. I like them. I think they're a little too much to use in real life. So their suggestion is, instead of calling people relatives, you would call them your yoke fellows. Instead of talking about your vocabulary, you might talk about your word stock. Instead of talking about logic, there'd be witcraft. Instead of conditional propositions, if says, and the conclusions of those propositions would be and says, and pros and cons, affirmations, negation would be yay says and nay says. There's a certain charm to that. I'm not sure how seriously someone would take you if you actually said these out loud. So I'm going to put that to the side. And now we're going to put some of the things I've talked about in a bit of a test. And we'll look at some of the most famous lines in the English language. This is a speech from Hamlet, of course. And we're going to go through and just note what is Anglo-Saxon and what is French or Latin. Okay, so to be or not to be, that is the question. This line is almost wholly Anglo-Saxon, except the question. That's Latin. You can tell by the tion kind of ending. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer. Okay, now you can see a bit of a contrast here. Noble is, I think, French. Mind is unclear because all these languages are actually in the same language family. So sometimes you have a word that's related to both the German and the French, and there's no way to tell. Suffer happens to be Latin. Okay, the slings and arrows, Okay, bracket that. That's all Anglo-Saxon. Of outrageous fortune, that's both those words are Latin. Or to take arms against the sea of troubles, that whole line is Anglo-Saxon. And by opposing, and them. So opposing there is Latin, and them is Anglo-Saxon. So you can see that Shakespeare has such a command of the language as to place the Anglo-Saxon and Latin words in a meshed order, and in ways that are pleasing to the ear. So he puts the Anglo-Saxon words together and then contrasts them with Latinate words, which is why I don't quite take the advice that you should always select the Anglo-Saxon simpler word. If you're going to write maybe a technical paper, that might be the case. But I think in your own everyday language use and in enjoying poetry and those kinds of things, you'll be served well by trying to pay attention to the contrast and the rhythm of both of these two languages inside the one at the same time. So I hope I've taught you something about your own language, which is always a fun thing to do. If you found this enlightening, then maybe you'll enjoy my next talk, which I hope to give, which will be about some poetic tricks that you can play by regressing the language. In other words, using older forms of words that have a little more etymological significance to them. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that.